everybody, Jim here, welcome back to Mad Panic Gaming. Today, since I've made several videos on the best Nintendo Switch shoot-em-ups recently, I thought I might as well go back to the 16-bit consoles and take a look at the best there as well, because this is a genre that the fourth generation of consoles certainly did justice. So today we start with the Sega Genesis, the 16-bit console that arguably featured the best lineup of shooters of its day, and I've narrowed it down to 8 titles that I think are the absolute best. Starting with a pretty obvious pick, this is MUSHA, aka MUSHA Alesta on the Japanese Mega Drive, making it part of Compile's long-running and much celebrated Alesta series that spans across numerous different consoles. MUSHA is fairly unique among its Genesis shooting peers in terms of aesthetics, merging feudal Japan with futuristic robots, and it has you piloting a decidedly kick-ass mech suit. And the gameplay here is simply fantastic. You start out pretty weak, but the power-ups start pouring in almost immediately, and they come in 2 varieties. The small P-chips you collect will increase the strength of your main shot, and eventually grant you some little satellite options to further boost your firepower. And you can actually change the way they behave with the push of a button. They can rotate around you, home in on enemies, or stay in tight formation with you. The other power-ups are big floating orbs that come in 3 different colors and grant you various abilities. And the more you pick up of the same color, the stronger their effect becomes. Eventually, the green orbs give you a big super laser. The blue orbs create a durable shield around you that is extremely useful, and the red orbs equip you with black hole missiles that can suck up enemy bullets. Again, very useful in a game like this. With all that firepower available to you, plus a pretty generous allotment of 1-ups, MUSHA is actually one of the more forgiving shooters on the Genesis. But that's not to say it's not challenging at all, because it certainly can be. But the challenge is fair. You can increase or decrease the difficulty level, of course, but the gameplay always remains fast, frantic, and very fun. Lots of cool power-ups, some intense boss battles, outstanding graphics, not just by 1990 standards, mind you, but of the generation as a whole, and a seriously kick-ass soundtrack. Taking all of that into consideration, this is probably my favorite of the Genesis shooters, but even if it's not your favorite, it's hard to argue it's not among the best. Simply put, MUSHA rules. Next up, Troubleshooter, aka Battlemania, and this is another game that has a very forgiving difficulty, making it a decent choice for people who either aren't particularly good at shooters or might be new to the genre. It's very generous with health power-ups, so if you play with a bit of caution, you can rack up a lot of hit points, and the main gimmick to the gameplay is that you're playing as 2 characters at once, with Mania locked into firing to the right of the screen, and Maria being able to fire either right or left, and you'll be doing a lot of swapping back and forth as enemies come at you from various locations and angles around the screen. As usual, you can increase your weapon strength with power-ups, but before each stage you can also choose between several different attachments that grant you different super bomb attacks. And instead of having a limited supply, you simply have to wait for your charge meter to be full to use it, and these attacks are pretty devastating, either wiping away lots of smaller enemies in a single stroke, or dealing some big damage to bosses. Again, it's on the easier side of the shooter scale, but it's still very fun, and has probably my favorite characters and setting of any 90s shooter. Mania and Maria are kind of like a 16-bit dirty pair, and Troubleshooter overall features a great 80s anime aesthetic that I really like. The visuals are elaborate and colorful, the gameplay is smooth and fluid, and the soundtrack is really catchy and enjoyable too. Overall, this is a fantastic game, and it also has a sequel that unfortunately never made its way to the Genesis, that being Battlemania Daigenjo, which is even better in my opinion, primarily because it allows for 8 directional shooting, which is a godsend. So consider this my endorsement of both games, I guess. However you can, definitely give one or both of the Battlemania games a try, they are awesome. Next up we have Gaiares, which is another 1990 release, and this, I would say, is a considerably more difficult game than the two we just looked at, but it is also supremely fun. It's another side-scrolling shooter, and the main gimmick here is what the game calls your TAS system. Basically, it's a little satellite that follows your ship around that you can deploy with the push of a button. It'll then attach itself to an enemy, and when it returns, it brings with it a new weapon system. So, depending on the enemy, you could get a multi-directional shot, a homing shot, or a powerful laser beam. And the more times you draw from the same enemy type, the more powerful that weapon becomes. So, if you're anything like me, you'll memorize which enemies give the best weapons, and hit them over and over again until you're an absolute killing machine. Aside from that, the TAS itself also fires whatever weapon you have equipped, and it can act as a shield, canceling any bullets it comes into contact with. You also automatically drop missiles as you fire, and the only actual collectible power-up in the game is a Darius-style energy shield that lets you absorb a few hits before dying, which is an indispensable power-up because Gaiares can be pretty tough at times. But it is very fun and the controls are spot on. It also features some damn good graphics for 1990, and the soundtrack is pretty good too. So overall, this is an excellent game, and definitely the best shooter by Telenet. Some people think this is the best shooter on the Genesis bar none, and while I personally don't think it's the absolute best, it's definitely among the best. This game kicks ass. Next up, we have the original Raiden, or as it's known on the Genesis, Raiden Trad. I don't know what the Trad is supposed to stand for, but in Japan this game is known as Raiden Densetsu, which means the Raiden Legend, which I guess makes sense because in some ways this game is indeed legendary. At least as far as it inspired a ton of clones in the early and mid-90s, but this original game is still a hell of a lot of fun to play. If you've never played a Raiden game, the premise is pretty simple. It's a vertically scrolling shooter that offers you different colored weapon power-ups to choose from, each granting a different weapon system. And the more you collect of the same color, the more powerful that weapon becomes. Here you only have red and blue to choose from, but a purple laser shot would be introduced in the sequels. You can also pick up missile power-ups that either grant homing or power missiles, and to top it off, you have a limited supply of super bombs. So you've at least got some options here on how you'll tackle this game. I personally stick with the good old spread shot and homing missile combo, covering as much of the screen as I possibly can. But the high damage of the blue laser and power missiles is especially useful when you want to make quick work of bosses. Overall, this is an admirable port of the original arcade game, even if it admittedly features some fairly bland graphics. The sound design, I would say, fares better than the visuals. It's pretty good, but at the end of the day, this is Raiden, and the most important aspect is the gameplay, which is solid, fun, and definitely challenging. The first stage or two might lull you into a false sense of security, but that's when Raiden Trad decides to start kicking your ass. I've been playing this game off and on for the last 30 years, and it still gives me a run for my money. But if you're just looking for a solid shooting experience that'll keep you coming back for more, this is where it's at. Next up, we have Advanced Buster Hawk Gleylancer by Messiah. And this is a game that until very recently had been a Japanese Mega Drive exclusive, but a company called Retrobit recently released an English reproduction cart that can be played on original hardware, which is awesome because now many more people can enjoy this especially great shooter. It's another game that is very approachable for newcomers, as its default difficulty setting is rather forgiving, and the main gimmick to the gameplay is the 2 satellites that hover around your ship. You can change their weapons out with power-ups obviously, but before you start playing you have the choice of 7 different behaviors for them. So you can have them automatically lock onto enemies, which is obviously very useful. They can follow your ship Gradius style, which can also really come in handy, or just have them fire in the direction corresponding to your movement. It's a pretty cool little gameplay feature, and the weapons at your disposal include things like a twin shot, lasers, and a flamethrower, which I'm not sure how that would work in space, but screw it, it's video game logic. Anyway, Gleylancer plays really well, the controls are tight and responsive, and the experience overall is really fun, again, even if it can be a bit on the easy side. Another big selling point though is the outstanding visuals, which really do show off the capabilities of the Genesis. Lots of detailed backgrounds, elaborate enemy designs, and some nice looking cutscenes as well, and the soundtrack is also pretty damn good. This is a game that I put in the same category as something like Troubleshooter, where sure it's not the most brutal shmup ever made or anything, but when you take everything into account, it's an all-around solid game and one of the best Genesis shooters. Next up, a game I had a mild obsession with for a while, and that is Fire Shark. And it's hard for me to pinpoint why I like this game so much, because it honestly does come across as being kind of bland as far as Genesis shooters go, lacking the mech suits and spaceships of some of the other games I'm talking about in this video. But it just has that solid feel that Toaplan games typically had. It's kind of similar to Raiden in that it's a vertically scrolling shooter with a few different colored power-ups that give different weapons, but you'll also be needing to collect separate power-ups that increase your ship's strength, and only after collecting 3 of them do you go up a level. And yes, when you get the red flamethrower weapon to full power, it is indeed epic. You also have some super bombs at your disposal, but other than that, this is just a straightforward and very well made shooter. It's not the toughest shooter on the Genesis, in fact it's one of the few that I've ever cleared without dying, but it still presents a decent enough challenge on the default difficulty setting, and you can bump it up if you want something a little more intense. The major drawback though is when you die deep into the game, you get sent back to a checkpoint and you are completely powered down. You're basically screwed and might as well just start the whole game over. That's probably why I eventually cleared this one without dying, because that's really the only way to approach it. If I get killed in stage 8, I just hit the reset button. Anyway, this certainly isn't the flashiest shooter on the Genesis, but it's a hell of a lot of fun and one I go back to time and time again. Fire Shark is pretty damn good. Next up, we have the amazing, wondrous, and other adjectives. It's Truxton, aka Tatsujin. And this is another Toaplan shooter, and it takes the basic gameplay premise of Fire Shark, beefs it up, and sends it to outer space. You again have different colored power-ups to choose from that grant different weapons, and you also need to collect separate power-ups to increase your weapon's strength. But instead of only needing 3 to level up, you now need 5. But once you do level up, you get some serious firepower. You've got your red spread shot, always a classic, the prerequisite powerful green laser, and the blue electric thunder beam, which is the favorite of most players. You can also collect speed boost power-ups and the all-important super bombs that in this game deploy a nice big skull of death to let your enemies know you mean business. I find Truxton to be considerably more difficult than Fire Shark. There's seemingly more bullets to contend with, enemies often take longer to kill, and their movements are more erratic. So yeah, it seems like the plan all along was to make a more difficult Fire Shark in space. Which, come to think of it, I'd love to literally see the plane from Fire Shark fly into outer space, just like in Strikers 1945, and start kicking some alien ass. Anyway, Truxton. This game is a lot of fun, but be prepared for quite a challenge, and just know that while there are only 5 stages, you have to play through 5 loops to properly beat the game. And that literally takes hours to do, so strap in if you really want to see this one all the way through. I usually just settle for 1 loop, or at least until I die, hurl some profanities, and then play something else. Difficulty aside, this game looks good, sounds good, and plays great. It's a classic for a reason, and you may have already noticed, but I'm actually playing an enhanced version via a ROM, with further improved graphics and sound to make the experience even closer to the arcade. It's not an official release obviously, but if you're playing on an emulator, this version is excellent. And since everyone says I sound like Mark from Classic Game Room, it's the best shoot 'em up in the known universe, it's got to be Truxton. It might also be the best shoot 'em up in unknown universes, we just don't know. Finally, to cap things off, we've got Lightning Force, aka Thunderforce 4 by Technosoft. And there is some debate over which is the better game, this or Thunderforce 3, but I always go with Part 4 for several reasons. One is that obviously this is a great playing game, it's a lot of fun, and it's at least a bit more challenging than the third game, which leaned more toward the easy side. You have 5 different weapon systems you can acquire, and you can swap back and forth between all of them anytime you like, which is extremely useful because sometimes you need a homing shot, sometimes a tail gun is better, and sometimes you just need that balls-to-the-wall firepower to deal with bosses, eventually even gaining access to an awesome laser beam charge attack, so plenty of options for destruction here, and it's at least not too easy. Plus, the graphics in Lightning Force are simply breathtaking. I'd say they're definitely the best of any game I've talked about today, and the soundtrack is one of the most kick-ass of this generation of consoles, honestly. It's Genesis heavy metal at its finest. The one big drawback, though, is that with those impressive graphics and tons of activity on screen at any one given moment, there is shock of all shock, slow down in a Genesis game. Oh my god. This definitely hurts the gameplay a bit, but honestly, the game is otherwise so awesome, it doesn't really detract that much from the overall experience. Pretty much anything from Technosoft is great, the whole Thunderforce series is worth playing if you like a good shooter, but I think this game is the highlight of the series, and certainly at the very top of the list of Genesis shmups that you need to play. It's awesome. Hey everybody, Jim here, welcome back to Mad Panic Gaming, where today, since I recently made a video on the best Sega Genesis shooters, I thought it was only fair to make one on the best SNES shooters too. It's not a 16-bit console best known for its great shmups. That honor really goes to the Genesis and the PC Engine, but despite that fact, the SNES is home to some of my favorite shooters from this generation. Slow processor be damned, because the SNES library features some all-time shooting classics. So sit back, relax, and let's take a look at what I think are the absolute best. First up, we'll start with one of my personal favorite shooters ever, and that's Gradius 3 by Konami, which was a launch title for the SNES in North America. And as a launch title, it did a great job showing off what the SNES could do in terms of graphics, sound, and gameplay. It's true that there is a ton of slowdown in this game, but I have to say that after playing a modded version that removes the slowdown and playing the arcade version quite extensively, that slowdown is actually a lifesaver, because this is otherwise one brutal shooter. With that slowdown though, this is actually one of the more manageable shooters out there and a great place to start for beginners. You get a wide variety of power-ups to choose from, absolutely beautiful graphics by the standards of 1990, an amazing soundtrack, and most importantly, fun and reasonably challenging gameplay. There were a few Gradius games before this one and a few that came out after it, and I've played them all, and I don't think I'll ever get tired of this gameplay style, and the third game is still my favorite in the series. Gradius 3 represents the peak of Konami's 16-bit awesomeness. Actually, did I say that Gradius 3 is the peak of 16-bit Konami? Because I think a lot of people would argue that it's actually this game, Axelay from 1992. And it's easy to see why, because this game kicks some serious ass. First and foremost, this is a beautiful game that takes full advantage of the SNES hardware. In particular, the Mode 7 vertically scrolling stages are very striking. But the entire game features some very colorful and detailed stages, and some massive bosses to take on that all have some very cool designs. And as is typical of Konami around this time, Axelay has a pretty damn good soundtrack that really drives the action forward. That's all well and good, we all love a game that looks and sounds nice, but Axelay also has it where it really counts, and that's in the gameplay. It's a blend of both vertically and horizontally scrolling stages, which is nice for a bit of variety, and you've got a bunch of different weapon loadouts to choose from, with more weapons becoming available as you progress through the game. Also, it's not the fastest playing shooter ever made. It moves at a fairly leisurely pace most of the time, but doesn't suffer from nearly as much slowdown as Gradius 3, and most importantly, Axelay is a lot of fun. There are a few different difficulty levels to choose from, but overall this is a decently challenging game that I've played through numerous times and still come back to on a fairly regular basis. In short, this is a fantastic shooter, certainly a standout title on the SNES, and it's a game you should play immediately if you haven't already. Next up, the 1991 classic that is UN Squadron, aka Area 88, which is a port of the 1989 arcade game of the same name, but definitely does enough different from its arcade counterpart to set itself apart. You have 3 selectable characters to choose from that each start out with their own unique fighter jet, but as you complete missions and earn money, you can purchase a variety of new ships that each come with their own stats and weapon loadouts, which is in keeping with the original manga series as it focuses on a group of mercenary fighter pilots for hire. So there's quite a bit of variety in the ships you can use and the weapons available to you, which works well with the variety of missions you'll take on. Sometimes you'll be assaulting ground or seafaring targets, sometimes going on bombing runs, and sometimes taken to the skies for some aerial dogfights. So the weapons you choose to take with you are very important. UN Squadron is a fun and fairly challenging game with more variety than your average shoot-'em-up at the time. Plus, this is a pretty good looking game with colorful, detailed environments and again a wide variety of stages to play in. The soundtrack is kind of so-so in my opinion, with some tracks being really good and some just kind of being there, but taking everything into account, UN Squadron is definitely one of the best shooters on the SNES, and well worth your time if you're a fan of the genre. Next up, we've got a shooter that I find often gets overlooked, and that's probably because it's a port of a far superior Neo Geo game, but that is Aero Fighters from 1993. Developed by Video System, you might be more familiar with its alternate title, Sonic Wings, as this is a port of the first game in the series, which debuted in 1992. It is a stripped-down port of the Neo Geo game, offering you fewer ships to play as, and featuring significantly downgraded visuals and sound, but despite all of that, this is still a very well made and fun shooter. It was made as well as they could make it anyway, given the hardware limitations. If you've ever played a Tkyo shooter such as Strikers 1945 or Gunbird, then you know what to expect here, as it's essentially the exact same gameplay style. Just annihilate everything in sight and grab those power-ups and or super bombs. Your starting power level is pretty weak, but with just a few power-ups, you become an absolute death machine. Colliding with enemies will only bring you down a power level, but getting hit by enemy fire will bring you back to square one. The gameplay is challenging, though there are a few difficulty levels to choose from, and this is a very fun shooter that I think deserves more praise than it typically gets. Sure, it doesn't hold a candle to the Neo Geo, but hey, few things can. Aero Fighters looks good, sounds good, and plays great. In short, it's awesome. Next up, we have Darius Twin from 1991. Developed and published by Taito, and this is a game that I think is all around solid, even if it's not exactly mind-blowing in any one department. Obviously, if given the chance, you'd rather play an arcade Darius game, or perhaps one of the later games in the series like G-Darius or Darius Gaiden, but looking back to 1991, this was pretty damn good. If you've ever played a Darius game, then you know what to expect here. Destroy lots of enemies and collect power-ups to improve various aspects of your ship, including your primary and secondary weapons, your defensive shields, and there are also power-ups for extra lives and clearing the screen of enemies. And it just wouldn't be a Darius game without plenty of boss battles against spaceships in the form of various giant fish and crustaceans. It's all here just as you'd expect, and the gameplay is solid, fun, and presents a decent challenge. The visuals are also quite nice, with some especially detailed stages, and those big boss ships always look especially cool. And the sound design is pretty solid too. The only thing that really holds this game back, just like with Aero Fighters, is that it doesn't quite live up to its arcade counterparts in many departments. But when taken on its own merits, this is again an all-around solid shooter, and one that's well worth playing if you haven't already, but especially if you consider yourself a Darius fan. Next up, since I wanted to feature at least one Japan exclusive title, of which there are several, Including the excellent Parodius series of games, I decided to go with Macross Scrambled Valkyrie from 1993. It was developed by Winkysoft, and as far as I know, it's the only shooter they ever worked on, but they definitely should have developed more because they did a damn fine job with this one. If you've never played it before, it's obviously based on the Macross series of manga and anime, and features 3 playable characters, each piloting their own unique ship. And each ship has 3 different forms: the fighter jet, the Garwalk, and the Batroid, each with its own separate weapons that can be powered up 3 times apiece. Instead of being taken out in a single hit, you have an energy bar that thankfully can be refilled with power-ups. At its core, Scrambled Valkyrie is just a fairly straightforward shooter. Just blast everything that appears on screen, collect score bonuses and power-ups, and destroy a boss at the end of each stage. What really puts this game over the top, though, is that it's just designed really well. It's fun and reasonably challenging, there's a bit of variety, and the license is used really well. Recognizable characters and ships, great visuals, and some solid sound design as well. It's really a shame that this one was never released outside of Japan, because as the title of the video states, this is for sure one of the best shooters on the console, and one that I recommend 110%. Next up, another absolute classic from 1993, and that's R-Type 3, The Third Lightning by Irem, and this is to date my favorite R-Type game and the one I've played the most over the years. With some of the other games in this video, I've mentioned that they're not nearly as good as their arcade counterparts, but here we have a game that has no arcade counterpart and was made specifically for the SNES. And I'd honestly much rather play this than the first couple of R-Type arcade games, and it's definitely a big improvement over Super R-Type. Here, unlike in the previous games, you actually have a choice of multiple different force balls to choose from, each with a different weapon loadout. Something that would carry on to later games in the series, and after you've made your choice, it's 100% balls to the wall, white knuckle action, and damn can this game kick your ass. R-Type games are generally known for their methodical pace and high difficulty, but this game feels like it was made by some real masochists. Tons of enemies and stage hazards, segments that require some sharp reflexes, and boss battles that'll definitely test your mettle. You've got access to plenty of firepower, including a supercharged shot that annihilates pretty much anything it touches, and trust me, you're going to need it. Amazing gameplay coupled with some truly outstanding visuals and sound design make R-Type one of my favorite 16-bit shooters. Last but certainly not least, we have what I think is overall the best shooter on the SNES, and that is 1992's Space Megaforce by Compile, or as it's known in Japan, Super Alesta, which puts it in the same company as some of Compile's other legendary shooters like MUSHA, Robo Alesta, and Blazing Lasers. In fact, if I had to compare Space Megaforce to just one game, Blazing Lasers would be it, because the two games have a lot in common. Vertically scrolling, high-intensity shooting action with a bunch of different weapon systems, 8 in total, each becoming more destructive with power-ups, and throw in some super bombs for good measure. This game is so much fun, and it presents a pretty decent challenge, especially when the screen is filling up with enemies and bullets, but the power-ups never stop coming, so you've got plenty of firepower to fall back on. And the game runs at a fairly brisk pace, which is surprising as the SNES isn't exactly the most accommodating console for shooters as a consequence of having a relatively slow processor at the time. But Compile found a way, because Space Megaforce runs about as well as you'd expect it to run on a PC Engine or Genesis, and all with some especially nice visuals and a pretty good soundtrack as well. Taking all of that into account, I can say again that I think this is the all-around best shooter on the SNES, and another one of my favorites from the 16-bit generation as a whole. If you've still never played Space Megaforce for some reason, rectify that immediately, because this game is all kinds of awesome. Hey everybody, Jim here, welcome back to Mad Panic Gaming, where today we are taking a look at what I think are the absolute best shoot-em-ups on the mighty PC Engine. This is a console that I'd never played in my life, nor the TurboGrafx 16 up until I started collecting retro games some 15 years ago. But once I discovered it, I was immediately made aware of just how many amazing shooters are available for this classic console, both on HuCard and on CD. And though the competition is steep, the PC Engine might just have the best lineup of shooters from the 16-bit generation. So I chose what I think are the 8 best, 4 on HuCard and 4 on CD. Here we go. First up, we have one of my personal favorite PC Engine shooters, and that is 1989's Gunhed, aka Blazing Lasers, which is actually a movie tie-in game for a film also called Gunhed, which I've personally never seen, but I can't imagine that it's better than the game because this is one of the most polished and best playing shooters from this generation. And it's a collaborative effort between Compile, the developer of some all-time great shooters as well as the Puyo Puyo series, and Hudson Soft, who gave us more great games than I can count. Considering the previous works of the two developers, Gunhed fittingly feels like a cross between Super Star Soldier and one of the Alesta games. In terms of the visuals, sound design, and general feel of the gameplay, Gunhed has Hudson Soft written all over it. But in terms of the power-up system, it's exactly like Alesta. There are numerous power-ups marked with different numbers that grant different weapons, and picking up the same power-up multiple times increases its attack strength. There are some old standbys like the spread shot and homing missiles, as well as more exotic weapons like the Super Laser, which is the spitting image of the laser weapon from Super Alesta. You can also pick up super bombs, which the game is very generous with, and they're great for clearing the screen or dealing some big damage to bosses. And though you only start out with a handful of lives, you can quickly earn more by building up your score, which is crucial as there are only 4 continues. So you'll be wanting as many lives as possible to get through this one. Though I'd say in terms of difficulty, Gunhed is on the more moderate side. Not too tough, but not exactly a cakewalk either, making it perfect for players just getting into the genre that want to sharpen their skills a bit. Regardless, this game plays as smooth as butter, features some beautiful visuals for the time, and an outstanding high-energy soundtrack. And most importantly, it is a lot of fun, which is why it's one of my personal favorites. Whether you call it Gunhed or Blazing Lasers, I call it awesome. Next up, from 1990, we have the one and only Aero Blasters, aka Airbuster, which was initially developed for arcades by Cornejo, a developer that's no stranger to some top-notch shooters, and the port was handled by Hudson Soft themselves, and considering the PC Engine is essentially their console, they were best suited to make some killer ports from the arcade. And Aero Blasters certainly is. This is one of the best looking, best sounding, and best playing shooters you can get on a HuCard, and it will give you one hell of a challenge. It's not all that different from any other shooter on paper, just blast everything in sight and grab all the power-ups you can. But it's the execution that helps Aero Blasters stand out. For instance, power-ups don't just float across the screen like in most other shooters, but instead, they explode from a canister all at once, and then it's a mad scramble to scoop them up. There's a downside to this obviously, as it's easy to miss a power-up that you want or grab one that you don't. But combined with all of the bullets and projectiles flying at you and numerous obstacles you'll sometimes be expected to navigate around, this makes for a uniquely frantic gameplay experience. As the game progresses, it'll throw more and more curveballs at you, forcing you to make your way through cramped corridors at top speed, or even changing the physics altogether when you're flying in a zero-G environment. Aero Busters might just have you banging your head against a wall with just how tough and sometimes frustrating it can be. But once you get the hang of it, this game is damn fun, and even offers up some co-op gameplay for when you want somebody to suffer right along with you, because it certainly doesn't make the game any easier. Throw in some truly beautiful graphics with some especially elaborate stages and large boss sprites, plus a high-energy soundtrack for some truly white-knuckle action, and what you've got is an instant shooting classic. In short, Aero Blasters kicks ass. Next up, we have one of my personal favorite Konami shooters, and that is 1991's Salamander, which is a port of the 1986 arcade game also known as Life Force. And it's important to reiterate that this is a direct port of the arcade, which itself is quite different from its NES counterpart, which is how I first played Life Force. Whereas that version was changed to play more or less exactly like Gradius, complete with the signature power-up system, this version instead simply gives you power-ups as you destroy certain enemies, and all you have to do is touch it to activate it. Power-ups include a laser shot, ripple shot, missiles, force fields, and of course, the classic Gradius options that greatly amplify your firepower. Another fun twist on the gameplay in Salamander is, of course, that it switches from being a horizontal shooter to a vertical shooter between stages, which some people don't care for, but I appreciate the added variety it brings to the gameplay. Aside from that, this is an excellent playing game, very accurate to the arcade original, with lots of obstacles, enemies, and fun gimmicks to each stage, and some truly epic boss battles against some really grotesque creatures, reminding me a bit of the R-Type series actually. It's a ton of fun, but it can also kick your ass from pillar to post, so if you want to get good at this one, strap in for the long haul, and have a pillow handy to scream into. Infuriating, but satisfying. Also, in addition to the solid gameplay, this port features graphics and sound that are as true to the arcade as possible. Obviously, it's not going to be a perfect conversion, but the visuals here are very nice, and honestly not too far off from the original game. And the soundtrack is simply amazing, which should come as no surprise if you're at all familiar with Konami shooters, and it's debatable if the PC Engine sound chip actually makes these already awesome tunes sound even better. Taking all of that into consideration, the killer graphics and sound, plus the near-perfect gameplay, Salamander is definitely one of the best shooters you can play on a HuCard. Next up, we have a game that many players believe is not only the best shooter available on the PC Engine, but quite possibly the best of the entire 16-bit generation, and that is 1992's Soldier Blade, which was once again developed and published by Hudson Soft, and damn did they know how to make one hell of a shooter. This game was actually completed in about 6 months in order to be ready for an annual shooting caravan competition hosted by Hudson Soft. But you'd think they'd been working on it for at least twice as long, because this definitely is the best looking, sounding, and playing shooter that they've ever released. Or at least if you ask me. But considering that this is the third game to appear on the PC Engine in the Star Soldier series, with the groundwork already being laid by Super Star Soldier and Final Soldier, the basic gameplay was already there and simply needed to be refined. In Soldier Blade, you have a choice of 3 different primary weapons to pick up, each represented by a different colored power-up, not unlike what you'd see in games like Raiden or Truxton, and they can be powered up to extreme levels. Plus, you can hold up to 3 different colors at a time, and when you're ready, sacrifice one of them for a devastating super bomb attack. But fret not, because this game is very generous with power-ups, so there's always plenty more to pick up. You can acquire a cool little helper ship for some added firepower, and overall, just like Gunhed, this is a pretty forgiving shoot 'em up while not being a total pushover. Plus, it also includes a hard mode for those of us seeking a bit more of a challenge, and a caravan mode that gives you a limited window of time to max out your score. The gameplay is honestly damn near perfect, and there's nothing at all I'd change about it. And the visuals are simply stunning. I'm honestly shocked they were able to accomplish this on a mere HuCard, and the soundtrack features some of the greatest chiptunes to ever come from a 16-bit console. So top to bottom, Soldier Blade has to be considered one of the best shooters on the PC Engine and of its generation. Next up, let's shift over to the PC Engine CD and another excellent port of a Konami arcade classic, and that's 1992's Gradius 2, which is obviously a conversion of the 1988 original, and once again, Konami knocked it out of the park in terms of gameplay, graphics, and sound, as this is an almost perfect port. It maintains the classic Gradius gameplay style, picking and choosing what power-ups you want to activate, but this time around giving you a choice of several different weapon loadouts, and then turning you loose in a game that is honestly not quite as challenging as its arcade counterpart, but considering how brutally difficult the original is, that's not such a bad thing. And certainly doesn't mean that this game is easy, because far from it. Gradius 2 will still give you one hell of a challenge, and even throws in an exclusive stage not featured in the arcade, which is a nice little bonus. You'll contend with all manner of enemies, obstacles, and bosses as you blast your way through what is probably the crown jewel of Konami's arcade ports on the PC Engine. The gameplay is near perfect, as are the visuals and audio. This being a Super CD game, Konami had a little bit more muscle to work with, and as such, aside from a minor downgrade in resolution, Gradius 2 looks almost identical to the arcade game and even includes a cool opening cutscene made just for the PC Engine. Not only that, but instead of creating a new remix soundtrack for the CD platform like some other games did, Konami instead gave us a perfect conversion of the original arcade soundtrack, which itself sounds amazing and once again features some of the best tunes to ever grace a shooter. After all, if the label said Konami, you knew you were in for some great music. This is honestly a flawless game in my opinion, regardless if you're talking about the arcade original or the PC Engine version, because there's really not much difference between the two. It's just an all-around solid and fun game with great visuals and sound design, and one of the best shooters available on the PC Engine. But if you're a Gradius fan, I'm sure you already knew that. Next up, we have 1992's Gate of Thunder, another game that was published by Hudson Soft but was developed by Red Company, who along with this game also developed the Far East of Eden series, the Bonk series aka PC Ginjin, and another amazing PC Engine shooter, Lords of Thunder. which I considered also adding to this list, but when I looked at the two side by side, I decided to go with Gate of Thunder as I feel it has a bit more to offer in the gameplay department. Because honestly, when it comes to the visuals and audio between the two, it's hard to choose a favorite. In terms of gameplay, Gate of Thunder is basically like an updated CD variant of Thunderforce 3, with a very similar weapon system and even having some of the same programmers as that game. You're given a few different colored weapons to choose from that include missiles, lasers, and a wave gun, each being able to be powered up multiple times, and you can swap between them at any time with the push of a button. You can also pick up a couple of satellite options that can absorb bullets and provide some extra firepower, and picking up a power-up when you're already maxed out triggers a firewall of death that annihilates enemies and clears their bullets from the screen, which is very satisfying. In terms of difficulty, Gate of Thunder is on the easier side of things, again much like Thunderforce 3. But it's damn fun and plays as smooth as silk. And on a technical level, it was a great showcase of what the hardware could do, which is why it was sold as a pack-in game with the Turbo Duo in North America. The graphics were absolutely stunning at the time with some very dense, colorful, and detailed backgrounds, plus some very cool enemy and boss designs, perfect for a space shooter. And the soundtrack is the stuff of legends. Absolutely awesome, hard-hitting, heavy metal tracks all throughout, which, needless to say, is great music to play to when you're destroying legions of enemy ships. So with all of that being said, and as is evidenced by the gameplay you're seeing here, Gate of Thunder is yet another all-time classic shooter on the PC Engine, and definitely one of the best the console has to offer. Next up, we have another great compile shooter, and that is Seirei Senshi Spriggan from 1991. Which, even before I played it, I was certain I was going to love it because I was thinking that a vertically scrolling shooter developed by Compile and featuring giant mechs had to play more or less like MUSHA, which I think we can all agree definitely wouldn't be a bad thing. Well, I was totally wrong about that, and this game plays pretty much nothing at all like MUSHA, but that's okay because this is still a great playing game, and it features a gimmick that is unique and adds a bit more depth to what could have otherwise been a fairly standard shooter. In Spriggan, your weapon power-ups come in the form of different colored orbs that grant different elemental powers, and collecting 3 of the same color gives you a super-powered version of that weapon, as you might expect. But you can also mix and match the colors to your heart's content, as you can hold 3 at a time, and different color combinations give you entirely different weapons. So for instance, you might equip yourself with some homing fireballs, a bullet-absorbing shield, or a huge wave shot that covers half the screen. And when you're tired of one weapon, or when you really need to dish out some extra punishment, you can sacrifice an orb as a super bomb. Not to worry though, as Spriggan is rather generous with power-ups, so there's plenty more where that came from. For this reason, Spriggan is another shooter on this list that isn't particularly difficult, at least not by shooter standards, making it a solid choice for beginners, but you can also increase the difficulty to give yourself at least a bit more of a challenge. Regardless though, the gameplay is great and a hell of a lot of fun, and this is certainly an impressive game in terms of its super colorful visuals that again are reminiscent of MUSHA, only with way more fantasy elements, and a soundtrack that will absolutely blow you away with its intense music, which is a running theme with all of these games now that I think about it. But what can I say? The devs back then knew that a good shooter requires some kick-ass tunes. Anyway, Seirei Senshi Spriggan is a great example of a top-notch shooter and one of the best available on the PC Engine. To wrap things up, I've chosen again what many fans argue is the single best shooter on the PC Engine and high in the running for best of the entire generation, and that is 1992's Nexzr, which was published by Nexzr and developed by Cornejo, the original developer of not only Aero Blasters, which you saw earlier, but also Super Star Soldier and its cutesy counterpart Star Piroger. A great little shooter in its own right. So they definitely knew what they were doing when it comes to this genre. And Nexzr is, without a doubt, the single best shooter that they ever developed, and is right up there with other classics like Soldier Blade, Truxton, and MUSHA. The real beauty of Nexzr is in its simplicity. It doesn't really give you a ton of things to worry about, aside from just dodging bullets and blasting enemies. There are power-ups to collect that increase the strength of your primary weapon, and you can pick up sub-weapons that activate automatically, but that's about it. No elaborate power-up scheme, no frills, not even any super bombs, which in any other game would be a real negative for me, but here I don't mind it so much because the gameplay itself is just so super smooth and finds a perfect balance of challenging and fun. It's not a cakewalk, but won't have you tearing your hair out either. And the stage designs are perfect and throw more than a few curveballs at you, reminding me of a cross between the aforementioned Super Star Soldier and Image Fight, but always keeping the intensity and action cranked way up, and it's a blast. Great for newcomers and veterans alike. Plus, as you can plainly see, Nexzr was also meant to be a showcase of what the Super CD games could do, showing off some very impressive visuals for the time, which include some very detailed backgrounds, huge boss sprites, and some nice looking cutscenes for the day, which actually included voice work from actors that had previously voiced characters for Gundam, which is especially cool. And again, as it seems like it was just the standard at the time, the music here is absolutely awesome. Sometimes giving you some high energy, heart-pounding tracks to play to, with some others being a bit more subdued, but the soundtrack is 100% kick-ass. And so is the game as a whole. Nexzr is undoubtedly one of the best shmups on the PC Engine, and one of the best shooters of the 16-bit generation, period.